So Sartre said that we are condemned to be free. We're we're condemned to make choices. We have no choice in the matter that we are condemned to make choices. We are condemned to be free. This is the problem that Milan Kundera brings up in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, remember? It's existential lightness and weight, whereas existential lightness is freedom. It's being void of responsibility. It's having endless choices. You're kind of floating around. You don't have anything to bring you back down to earth. Whereas existential weight, existential heaviness is when you have responsibility, when you have burdens, when you have things pulling you to earth, pulling you to reality, right? And in Camus' case, this pulling you to reality is sort of pulling you into a world of illusions, right? Because responsibility to Camus is an illusion. Responsibility are things that you make up in your head, things that you believe that you have to do, but you don't really need to do them, right? You don't need to do anything because in reality, you are light. You have existential lightness by default. Of course, she just might not be aware of that. But being aware of this lightness, being aware of your freedom, being aware of the fact that you have all these choices to make, but in the end, you're just going to die. That confrontation between your desire for meaning and the lack thereof, that's the absurd for Camus. And so to Camus, it is not that we're condemned to freedom, but rather the knowledge and belief of freedom. We're condemned to the belief that there is freedom or the knowledge of freedom. We're condemned by our choices. We're condemned by our knowledge of the world and the innumerable choices that this brings us. We're condemned to Kundera's unbearable lightness of being. The absurdist seeks to live without appeal. This is Camus. This is sort of his biggest point in the Myth of Sisyphus, to live without appeal. The absurdist wants to know, or Camus wants to know, can he live without appeal? Can he live without a reason to live? Can he live for the sake of living? And can he live with the sake of, out of the sake of living, for the sake of living? Can he live to live with the knowledge that he's going to die? Right? Can he live for the sake of living with the knowledge that he's going to die? This is his biggest question. Can he live without appeal? Because Camus is claiming that to live with meaning is analogous with almost going to trial and having a reason or an appeal to your crime, right? You have to appeal to your crime. You have to tell a judge, jury, and executioner, hey, I did this for this reason. Please let me live, right? But Camus saying, hey, no, you go to that trial and you say, hey, yeah, I committed the crime and I don't need a reason to doing it. I know that I'm going to trial. I know I'm going to be executed. That's just fine. I committed my crime and I know that I committed my crime and I'm taking responsibility for committing that crime, but I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm not going to give a reason for it. I'm going to live without appeal. Hence the plot of The Stranger, right? Rousseau in The Stranger, the protagonist, the stranger, right, had no reason to commit his murder. And in a sense, that makes Rousseau innocent. There wasn't a reason for it. He didn't have a choice in the matter, really, right? The sun got in his eye. The sun got in his eye and he shot him, right? That's what happened. The sun got in his eye, he got angry and he shot. That's what happened. That's how he explained it. He explained he did the murder because the sun got in his eye, which didn't even make any sense to him. And at the end of the day, he realized that, hey, I didn't actually have a reason to commit murder. I didn't have a reason, right? It sort of just happened. The same goes with life, right, guys? Life just happens. Life just happens. And I mean, I keep looking off in the because that's where my camera is. But life just happens, right? And I remember I was driving in the car with someone and a friend of mine, and I was like, so confused about life. I was just, I felt so guilty about things that I've done and I was trying to decide what to do with my life. And they just look at me and they say, hey, life happens. Life happens, right? It just happens. Like you make all these choices, but at the end of the day, like things happen to you 24/7. You're just this one dot in a sea full of infinitely many dots. And while you can control what you do, you can't control what happens to you. And we are all innocent because of this. We're all innocent. We don't need to justify our existence. And because of that, the absurdist is free. Unbound by meaning, the absurdist is free to live and be fully immersed in reality because they don't need a reason to live. They don't need a reason to find life worth living. They just find it worth living because they live life, right? So, a couple paragraphs down from the first line of section 4, absurd freedom, which is the section that we're going over today. Absurd freedom, which is section 4, the final section of chapter 1 of the Myth of Sisyphus, and absurd reasoning. We have, quote, if I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have a meaning, or rather, this problem would not arise. For I should belong to this world. I should be this world. To which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation. I cannot cross it out with a stroke of the pen. What I believe to be true, I must therefore preserve. What seems to me so obvious, even against me, I must support. And what constitutes the basis of that conflict, of that break between the world and my mind, but the awareness of it? If therefore I want to preserve it, I can through a constant awareness, ever revived, ever alert. What I believe to be true, I must therefore preserve. He's saying that, and what seems to me so obvious, even against me, I must support. Death is obvious, and it goes against him. It goes against his will to live. But he must support that death exists. He must support the fact that he's going to die. He must believe it. He can't just stroke it out, right? He can't just, nope, not going to die. He can't just cross the line out of death and say, nope, not going to do it, right? He's going to die. And there's an opposition here, right? There's something that his awareness of death brings him out of ignorance. And this is a very old concept, right? He's almost referring to the Garden of Eden, right? If I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have a meaning. It would this problem wouldn't arise, right? He would belong to the world. He would belong to the garden. He would belong to the Garden of Eden in a biblical sense. Because in the beginning, man belonged to nature. He was at one with nature. He lived in the perfect, blissful garden of the prehistoric Earth, right? But then, man developed consciousness. He discovered the knowledge of good and evil. He became aware of existence, became aware of death, of himself, of who he was, of what reality was, and the fact that he was a person living on a planet with things that died and that he also was going to die. And in this awareness, he became separated and opposed to the world, right? And in Camus' case, the knowledge of this separation and our desire to return to the garden of familiarity is the absurd. It's the reason why the man from the beginning of Zapp's Last Messiah killed himself, right? He saw that dead deer and he realized that in order for him to live, he had to kill things and that he was also going to die. This is absurd. So he killed himself. Ah, damn, sneezing. But even so, since Camus cannot know for certain anything about reality, he claims that through constant awareness of his reality, he can at least be sure of what he feels, of what he experiences, right? And even if this experience turns out to be a simulation, he's still aware that he is experiencing it, whatever it is, right? And this is a very Buddhist idea. It's the idea that one can handle suffering through awareness, right? Through being aware of their surroundings and even being aware of their suffering, they can handle suffering. It is a way to live life without the need for a belief, without the need for dogma or an ideal, or the need for certainty. And in many ways, it is living without appeal. You don't have to live with a reason to live. You can just live because you're aware of the fact that you're alive, right? What interests me is that on the following page, Camus says, quote, at a certain point on this path, the absurd man is tempted, end quote. This is, again, very spiritual language. Both the Buddha and Jesus were tempted by evil in the Buddhist and Christian myths, right? To Camus, the absurdist is tempted by religion and dogma. He is tempted to believe in things that he does not know for certain, right? So while the Buddhist and the Christian are tempted with actions and desires, the absurdist is tempted with thoughts and beliefs. Beliefs, to Camus, are again a philosophical suicide for the absurdist. They are, in a sense, the absurdist version of sin. Belief brings one away from the absurd. And this is a suicide. This is basically because there's philosophical suicide and then there's plain suicide, right? In philosophical suicide, you're living for the future. You're living for that leap. You're living for that faith, right? And by living for the future, you're practically living for death. And if you're living for death, you're living as a dead man, right? Instead of just plain living. So to Camus, there isn't much difference between philosophical suicide and suicide. Because in one, you're dead, and the other, you're living as though you're dead. And of course, Camus is not saying that the religious person is living as though they're dead. He's saying that the person who once thought life was meaningless and takes that leap of faith and believes life is all of a sudden meaningful, that is the suicide. That is a philosophical suicide. And obviously, I brought that point in the last episode, but we'll move on. And since the absurdist does not live with beliefs, he lives a life of innocence. So it's kind of counterintuitive. The knowledge of the absurd, that which brings man away from the garden, is the very same thing that keeps him in it. Because he lives a life not of blissful ignorance, but blissful awareness of his ignorance, right? So Quote, it was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living and experience a particular fate is accepting it fully, end quote. This is very rebellious. It's a very like counter religion, counter dogma, counter science idea. It's hey, you know what? Not only does life not need meaning, but life is better without it. Right? This is a rebellion. And in many ways I feel like maybe this is a little repressed anger from maybe people telling him he was going to go to hell when he was young. I mean, every atheist experiences the day when someone tells them that they're going to go to hell. And a lot of people live with that resentment for the rest of their lives. And I mean, I've had that resentment too, and that's why I've thought this similar thought, and I still kind of I still think that way. I still think, yeah, life is better without meaning, and like, don't get me wrong, I fully agree with Camus, but I do want to say that there are reasons for the beliefs that people have, and that being rebellious, that revolt, I think partially, in my opinion, probably stems from that kind of like that repression of the soul, that repression of the absurd, kind of makes the absurd become a revolt, a rebellion against meaning, a rebellion against the idea that you need meaning to live, because you don't. You can live purely to live. You can live without appeal, right? You can live and experience a particular fate and accept it fully. This is Nietzsche's amor fati, right? It's love your fate. The knowledge that you will die and that you will never have certain answers for anything is precisely what sets you free to love your life for what it is. You are free to accept your life and live it fully with the knowledge that life is all you've got. So that's kind of that's important, right? Because once you reach that point in consciousness where you realize that you can't actually prove the existence of an afterlife or of God or of one objective meaning in the universe, while other people might criticize you for that, for your lack of a belief, you have that one trick up your sleeve, right? And that trick up your sleeve is that, hey, I'm without this belief, I'm free to live my life fully. I'm free to realize that, hey, this is all I've got. This this microphone, this computer, this water bottle right here, right? My hands moving around, my voice talking, this room in which I'm in, my dog who's sitting on the couch, the dog that I love, my girlfriend who's at work, she's working night shift at the hospital because she's a beast, my parents who brought me into this world, all these people who are in my life who I love and who love me, that's all I've got. That's all I've got, right? And a lot of people don't realize that. They think, oh, they take all these things for granted. And then they just off themselves. They don't realize that people love them, that there are people out there that love them, that there's that Nietzsche's single joy, right? That there will be a joy in your life that justifies all the suffering. This is all this is all we've got. This life is all we've got. And you are free to accept that life. You are free to accept it. You are free to love your fate. But you can't love your fate until you're aware that you have a fate. And that fate is that you're going to die. And why not just love your life, right? To Camus, the absurdist knowledge of impermanence is his revolt. Quote, the theme of permanent revolution is thus carried into individual experience. Living is keeping the absurd alive, keeping it alive above all, contemplating it. Unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. It is an insistence upon an impossible transparency. It challenges the world anew every second. Just as danger provided man that unique opportunity of seizing awareness, so metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. It is that constant presence of man in his own eyes. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate, without the resignation that ought to accompany it. End quote. The absurdist revolts against any and all ideas that there is some kind of certain belief or knowledge or answer to this world, right? And this constant revolt against certainty holds within itself just one thing for certain, that we're all gonna die. It's that Carsey Blanton song, right? Smoke alarm. We're all gonna die one day, right? But even so, the absurdist isn't just revolting against the meaning. They're revolting against the idea that they need meaning to live, right? Again, they're revolting against the idea that they need a meaning to live. They want to live without appeal. They're revolting against both suicide and philosophical suicide. And suicide, like philosophical suicide, is acceptance at its extreme. But the absurdist escapes this acceptance through simultaneous awareness and rejection of death. I'm going to die, but not right now. Right now, I am alive. I will die. I will die. But the future in which I am dead does not exist right now. In that sense, Camus posits the absurd man as the condemned man, which he thinks is the contrary to suicide. The man condemned to death is the opposite of the suicidal man. He says this because while the man condemned to death knows for certain that he'll die, he doesn't off himself. The condemned man still lives, taking every last breath until the bitter end. And through the revolt against both death and meaning, the absurdist finds, quote, his only truth, which is defiance. Because defiance is his action. That's his only truth because that's what he does. That's his action. That's how he responds to life, with defiance. That's his only truth because he lives it. He lives his truth. Quote, before encountering the absurd, the everyday man lives with aims, a concern for the future or for justification, with regard to whom or what is not the question. He weighs his chances. He counts on some day, his retirement or the labor of his sons. He still thinks that something in his life can be directed. In truth, he acts as if he were free, even if all the facts make a point of contradicting that liberty. But after the absurd, everything is upset. That idea that I am, my way of acting, is as if everything has a meaning, even if on occasion I said that nothing has. All that is given the lie in vertiginous fashion by the absurdity of a possible death. End quote. So, prior to the absurd, we live with goals and aims. We live our lives in order to prepare for a future in which life is better. In which moment is better? But this is faulty reasoning. In which the moment is better. But this is faulty reasoning, right? Because when that future comes, when that moment in the future comes, when that future moment comes, we will still be living for the future. Because if you're always living for the future, then you're never living for now. And you can't enjoy life if you're not here, if you're not living now. You can't enjoy life living later. You can only enjoy it now. And so the absurdity that comes from the knowledge of death is precisely what frees the absurd man to live their life. No longer are they living like a dead man. That is because living like a dead man isn't living at all, right? If you're not living, you're living like a dead man. And it's now, I'll admit, guys, I'm the kind of person that I do live for the future. I am terrible at living in the now. I'm constantly thinking about the next thing I'm gonna do. I have like a giant to-do list I have every week, and I'm constantly like, oh, what should I do? I have to do this, this, and that. But the truth is, I don't need to do any of that stuff. And it's really hard for me to like have all these passions and ideas about what I want to do in the future. And it's really hard for me to just accept like one idea, like, oh, I want to be like, maybe I should focus on writing, maybe I should focus on the podcast, maybe I should focus on, I don't know, becoming an actuary or my career, or et cetera, starting a website with my cousin or, yada, yada, yada. I have all these freaking ideas and I can't focus on one. And I think a lot of people have this problem. A lot of people like have all these ideas in their head and they can't focus on any of them and they're constantly living in the future. And if you just do what you want to do now, what feels right now, that those decisions become a lot easier to make because you don't have to make the decisions anymore, right? Your heart makes those decisions. I know it's cliche, but follow your heart. Follow your heart is the ultimate philosophy. I mean, it's do what you feel passionate about. Do what you love. Do things for the people you love. Follow your heart, right? Follow love, and that's why a lot of religions pose God as love, right? God is love. Follow love, follow your heart. And that's what the absurdist does, right? The absurdist follows their heart. The absurdist does what they need to do now. Because what you're doing now, by living in the now, you're consequently following your heart. Because your heart is what determines whether or not you're going to be alive or not. Your heart's beating, and by following your heart, you're following life, right? You're following your life. You're following your will to live. So Camus drives this point home on the next page. And I'll read the whole thing because it's very important. Quote, the absurd man realizes that hitherto he was bound to that postulate of freedom on the illusion of which he was living. In a certain sense, that hampered him. To the extent to which he imagined a purpose to his life, he adapted himself to the demands of a purpose to be achieved and become the slave of his liberty. Thus, I could not act otherwise than as the father, or the engineer, or the leader of a nation, or the post office subclerk that I am preparing to be. I think I can choose to be that rather than something else. I think so unconsciously, to be sure. But at the same time, I strengthen my postulate with the beliefs of those around me, with the presumptions of my human environment. Others are so sure of being free, and that cheerful mood is so contagious. However far one may remain from any presumption, moral or social, one is partly influenced by them, and even, for the best among them, there are good and bad presumptions. One adapts one's life to them. Thus, the absurd man realizes that he was not really free. To speak clearly, to the extent to which I hope, to which I worry about a truth that might be individual to me, about a way of being or creating, to the extent to which I arrange my life and prove thereby that I accept its having a meaning, I create for myself barriers between which I confine my life. I do like so many bureaucrats of the mind and heart who only fill me with disgust and whose only vice, I now see clearly, is to take man's freedom seriously. The absurd enlightens me on this point. There is no future. End quote. We are slaves to our ideals, right? We're slaves to our goals. We're slaves to the image of ourselves that we want to be. If you think you want to be a writer, you'll feel like you're a slave to writing. You have to write. And if you don't feel like writing, well, you just think there's something wrong with you, right? Um, because whenever I have writer's block or I haven't written in a while, I'm like, ah, I need to write because I want to be a writer. I've always wanted to be a writer, but I, it's hard for me to stop and think, well, why do I want to be a writer? What makes me think that I need to be a writer, that I am a writer, or that this is my dream in life? Because I had some memory of a teacher telling me, "Oh, you're a great writer, Greg. You need to keep writing," right? Because I had that spark lit up inside of me from that teacher telling me that. Why do we want to do anything? Why do we want to be a politician or a father or an engineer, et cetera, et cetera? Because a lot of these things are put in us. These ideas are put in us, and we start thinking about it. We become addicted to that idea. We become addicted to that ideal, that future image of us standing atop that podium, giving that speech, or getting that Nobel Prize, or getting that New York Times best-selling author title, or holding our child in front of us, right? We get that image in our head and we become addicted to it. And once we become addicted to it, we start thinking that that's who we are. That person in our head that we're imagining that we want to be, we start thinking that that's who we are. And and Camus saying that that confines us. That makes us a slave to our future ideal. Because you can't go for a hike. You're supposed to be a writer. You have to write today. You can't go for a swim. You have to study for that test to become a lawyer. And what Camus is trying to say here is that you aren't supposed to do anything. You don't have to do anything. The future doesn't exist, right? That future where you're holding that Nobel Prize or that award or whatever, that doesn't exist. Because the only thing that exists is now, right? Because all that is uncertain. You could die tomorrow. You could die the next day. You could die 5 minutes from now. A nuclear bomb could be shot from Russia and it could hit your house right now. Because nothing is certain. Death takes away all certainty because death is the ultimate certainty, right? We're all going to die one day. And when it all comes down to it, if you live for the future, then you are more or less living for death. The absurdist revolts against this by living for life, living for the sake of living, by denouncing the future. So after this, we see a comparison of the absurd to mysticism. Quote, mystics find freedom in giving themselves, by losing themselves in their God, by accepting his rules, they become secretly free. In spontaneously accepted slavery, they recover a deeper independence. But what does that freedom mean? It may be said, above all, that they feel free with regard to themselves, and so much free as liberated. Sorry, and not so much free as liberated. Likewise, completely turned toward death, taken here as the most obvious absurdity. The absurd man feels released from everything outside that passionate attention crystallizing in him. Death, too, has patrician hands which, while crushing, also liberate. End quote. So the absurd man gives himself to death as the mystic gives themselves to God. The crushing weight of the absurdist eventual death is what liberates them to live just as the mystics surrender to their gods to liberate them to live. The absurdist. The absurdist says, it's all good, we're all going to die anyways. And the mystic says, it's all good, I live for God anyways. That is, while the mystic feels free because nothing matters more than God, the absurdist feels free because nothing matters, period. Death liberates the absurdists from their enslavement to the daily absurdity of life. And in our society, with all our technology and quote unquote progress, we are at a point in which all the things that gave our hunter gatherer ancestors meaning and purpose in life is practically gone. Like, how many of you listening right now have a job that you basically don't do anything that if your job didn't exist, it wouldn't really affect anyone. Like it might affect some investors or like some random people that wanted some knickknacks or whatever, but it won't affect anyone's survival. Like how many of you have a job that won't affect anyone's survival? I'd have to bet at least 50% of you. At least 50% of you, if your job didn't exist, no one would die. And in a sense, that can make your job feel meaningless. And not only do we have bullshit jobs, but we have bullshit recreational activities, right? Like we're chilling on our phones, texting, we're watching all these TV shows. Like I've been addicted to Avatar: The Last Airbender for the past like 2 weeks. It's been keeping me up late. Like I've been staying up till like midnight, getting like 5 to 6 hours of sleep every night, being hella tired just because I'm addicted to this show, right? Like we do so many things that just like we don't need to do, but we do it anyways. So it's kind of pointless. And a lot of this is because of all our prosperity, because since we don't have to focus on surviving, we instead focus on things that don't really matter, right? Because survival is living, right? That's what surviving is living. Well, we used to focus on just living, right? That was our main focus, to live. But now we have we don't focus on living at all. We focus on who's gonna like our Instagram message or who's gonna like the meme that I just sent or um oh, I wonder if anyone's gonna text me today. I wonder what's at the store today. I wonder, I wonder what's happening in Russia today. Like we focus on all these things outside of us or away from us that we don't pay any attention to what's right in front of our face, right? And the obvious but clearly overlooked knowledge that death is inevitable gives us the awareness that most of the things that we do in the modern day simply don't matter, right? Our bullshit jobs don't matter. And if you don't know what a bullshit job is, just look it up on YouTube. There's a ton of videos on it. Um, anyways, I work for like a fintech company, right? So I do like investment analytics and stuff. And like it's basically a pointless job. Like without me working there, it wouldn't change that. Like for one, if I didn't work there, they would just hire someone else, right? And for two, if so one, I'm replaceable. And two, if this whole industry didn't exist, then the world would still go on fine, right? People wouldn't die. Everyone would live as if like basically people would just go on living, right? If this whole industry did not exist, it wouldn't matter. So there's one, replaceable, and two, your job just doesn't even matter in the first place, right? So that's kind of what a bullshit job is, right? And like obviously I care about my job because I need the money and stuff. So it's like I'm not saying that it's like totally bullshit, but because I do need the money I get from my job, and I do my job um like the best I can because I want to keep my job and I want to get raises and promotions, right? But at the end of the day, the job is pointless. It doesn't actually provide any value, any like meaningful value to anyone's lives, including my own, right? Other than it provides me with the resources I need to live and buy my girlfriend dinners, right? You know, treat the people I love well, treat me well, right? So, but either way, right? The job itself is meaningless. And the idea that we're going to die one day shows us that our time here is limited. Why waste your time living for a time that doesn't exist, right? Why live for the future? Quote, the absurd man thus catches sight of a burning and frigid, transparent and limited universe in which nothing is possible, but everything is given, and beyond which all is collapse and nothingness. He can then decide to accept such a universe and draw from it his strength, his refusal to hope, and the unyielding evidence of a life without consolation. Belief in the absurd is tantamount to substituting for quantity of experiences for the quality. End quote. So the absurd man lives in a world that they know will end for them. But even so, they were born without the choice to be born, right? And so everything in the universe is given to them. Beyond that which is given to them, there's nothing, right? Beyond their life, there's nothing. And since you will die, the quantity of your experiences is meaningless. The quantity will always get cut shorter than you want it to if you're aiming for it, if you're aiming for quantity, right? Because if you want a quantity of experiences and you're just going to die, then you're just going to get disappointed, right? But quality can't cut short, right? Quality is immeasurable. And with that, the absurdist draws its strength, right? The absurdist is aware of the privilege it is to live, that life is something that was given to them by accident, right? So if you have that bullshit job, just enjoy it, right? Like you're gonna have to work there anyways. You need the money. So why not just enjoy your job? Why not just do the best you can? Why not just accept the fact that you work there and like fucking get over it, right? Right? Just like be fully aware of the fact that hey, yeah, this job is pointless, but I make money from it. Why not just focus on it and have fun with it, right? Why not just find meaning in the struggle, in the fact that it's meaningless, right? To this point, he writes later, quote, but again, it is the absurd and its contradictory life that teaches us. For the mistake is thinking that quantity of experiences depends on the circumstances of our life when it depends solely on us. Here we have to be oversimple. To two men living the same number of years, the world always provides the same sum of experiences. It is up to us to be conscious of them. Being aware of one's life, one's revolt, one's freedom, and to the maximum is living, and to the maximum, end quote. So what he's saying here is that two men can live the same number of years, but if one of them is actually aware during those years, the quality of that experience is better. So this reminds me of something that my old high school teacher, Royce Johnson, who I've had on podcasts, something that he told me once, or what he told the whole class. He told a story about these two guys who they made a deal. One of them said, "Hey, I bet you if I run every day, I'll live longer than you. And they're like, okay, deal. Let's go. So the one guy runs every single day, and at like 40 years, the other dude dies. So, but the runner keeps running every day, and he doesn't die till he's like 8 years old. So he meets up with the non-runner, and he's talking to him. He's like, "Ha, I beat you. Told you if I ran every day, I'd live longer, and I lived longer. I beat you." And then the guy looks at him and tells him, "Yeah, but you spent all that time running, right? If you spend all your time running, if you spend all your time looking for the future, trying to live longer, then you're not really living, right?" You have to remember that the absurdists not living for something eternal, they need to live for now, right? Because they know they're gonna die. They know they're not gonna go to that pearly gates. They know that they're not gonna live forever, or at least they know that they can't know for certain that they're going to live forever, right? They can't know for certain if they're going to go to some afterlife. And because they live for now, they must exhaust everything they can out of life. They need to take every last drop of life. And being fully aware of it is how the absurdist does that. Think of it. When you're more aware and focused on something, the experience feels longer, right? And because of that, the quality of the experience is increased. So, quote, I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. End quote. So, from the absurd, Camus finds his revolt against the idea that he needs a reason to live. And from this revolt, he finds his freedom. He is free to live without appeal. He can live for the sake of living. And this freedom and this revolt, this conscious awareness of death and meaninglessness, is where Camus finds his passion, his fire for life. And with that, he can be passionate about life, right? With that, he transforms his invitation to death, to suicide, into rebellion of the heart and soul. The absurd man lives as if every day is both his first day and his last day. Everything is new, everything is given, and everything is temporary. And so the absurd man lives for now. The absurd man lives for now. The absurd man follows his heart, right? He follows his passions. He does what he feels passionate about. If he doesn't feel a passion, he at least feels what he's feeling now, right? He's paying attention to what's going on around him. He's taking it all in, right? And this addiction to ideals, this enslavement to the future or to some mythical concept, right? These things force you to not live for now. They force you to live for that thing that doesn't exist, that thing that you can't prove the existence of, right? That thing that's uncertain. And this is but before we leave the podcast, obviously I want to put in my plug, right? My book, The Man Who Killed God, it's all about that. It's about the protagonist who must go and kill those ideals, the gods, in order to save everything that he loves. And everything that he loves is now. Everything that he loves is life itself. So if you want to support the podcast, just click on the link in the description and purchase a book. But anyhow, I'll leave you with the final three paragraphs of Absurd Freedom, which will conclude chapter one of The Myth of Sisyphus and Absurd Reasoning. I'll come back next Monday with Jamal Lixet to go over some of the points I've addressed so far, and just so we can get the opinion of someone who has actually taught lectures on this book, right? Jamal is, next to my high school English teachers, one of my greatest philosophical influences. He is, of course, the one who introduced me to the myth of Sisyphus. With that said, thank you for listening, and here's the rest of An Absurd Reasoning. Quote, when Nietzsche writes, it clearly seems that the chief thing in heaven and on earth is to obey at length and in a single direction. In the long run, there results something for which it is worth the trouble of living on this earth as, for example, virtue, art, music, the dance, reason, the mind, something that transfigures, something delicate, mad, or divine. He elucidates the rule of a really distinguished code of ethics, but he also points the way of the absurd man. Obeying the flame is both the easiest and the hardest thing to do. However, it is good for man to judge himself occasionally. He is alone in being able to do so. Prayer, says Elaine, is when night descends over thought. But the mind must meet the night. Reply the mystics and the existentials. Yes, indeed, but not that night that is born under closed eyelids into the mere will of man. Dark, impenetrable night that the mind calls up in order to plunge into it. If it must encounter a night, let it be that rather that of despair, which remains lucid, polar night, vigil of the mind, whence will arise perhaps that white and virginal brightness which outlines every object in the night of the intelligence. At that degree, equivalence encounters passionate understanding. Then it is no longer even a question of judging the existential leap. It resumes its place amid the age-old fresco of human attitudes. For the spectator, if he is conscious, that leap is still absurd. Insofar as it thinks it solves the paradox, it reinstates it intact. On this score, it is stirring. On this score, everything resumes its place, and the absurd world is reborn in all its splendor and diversity. But it is bad to stop, hard to be satisfied with a single way of seeing. To go without contradiction, perhaps the most subtle of all spiritual forces, the preceding merely defines a way of thinking. But the point is to live.